Hi, and welcome everybody. I just want to thank you for joining the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center today for our event, Where Do We Go From Here? Criminal Justice Reform in Ohio. Before we begin, we just want to go over a few things we want to share. First, to streamline the appearance of the presentation, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. So what you'll do for anybody who's not sharing their video, you can navigate over to the three little dots above their screen, and you'll click hide non-video participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, rather at the bottom of your Zoom window. So for the Q&A, we would like you to submit questions at any point during the presentation, and note though that there is just a little bit of time for Q&A, so we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Third, we want to note that auto-generated transcription is available for today's event. If you navigate down to the live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should be able to select whether or not you'd like that to show, or you can hide that as well. Finally, I just wanted to note that this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center website, as well as on our social media channels. You can follow us at OSU Law DEPC. You'll get updates. You can stay up to date on our research, our programming, events. Finally, just thank you again for joining us. And Doug, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you to you and Yana and everybody, Texter as well, at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for helping us put this program together. I think we had one of the largest registrations we've had for an event like this, and so very grateful, and I know it's because of our terrific panelists that I'll get to in a minute. I'm Doug Berman, the Executive Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. You also see from DEPC Alex Fraga, who's our Senior Research Associate, and we're going to be sort of joint moderating, especially when we get to the Q&A section. I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of sort of how we're here, also plug the resource page that we've created over at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, where it captures so many of the things we'll be talking about today, and then briefly introduce our speakers. Each of them will get, I've told them, sort of 5 to 8 minutes to give their take on the lay of the land here in Ohio, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions either from Alex and I, or also from the audience as you use the Q&A feature. Background, I've been teaching at Ohio State, close to a quarter of a century now, and criminal justice reform in the state has been interesting since I got here, and so this is hardly a new topic. It's truly evergreen in so many ways, but I'll add on to that about 4 years ago, a little less than that, we started to get into conversation about what we might want to do as a center at the Ohio State University. I came up with this idea, wonderfully funded by the Charles Koch Foundation, to create the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. And literally the week in which we had finalized the agreement to start the center, the proposal for issue 1, what was known as issue 1, this incredibly ambitious constitutional reform proposal in the state to shift away from felony level drug sentencing in certain possession cases, redirect money to a range of treatment services, change earned time credit, all sorts of things were in issue 1. And we were very excited at the center to have that focal point for doing a series of programming to just figure out all the things that were in issue 1. Of course, issue 1 did not pass. It was voted down almost 2-1 back in 2018, but that really spurred the conversation that continued for the next 2 years, not quite culminating in the passage of HB1 and the near passage of SB3, but certainly generating continued interest, excitement, controversy over the way in which Ohio was dealing with drug offenders in particular, but with a range of criminal justice offenses and responses writ large. And we're incredibly lucky to talk about all of that and whatever aspects they think is valuable to look at as we're at this moment. Where do we go from here after kind of all the energy and excitement we've seen, not just in Ohio, but obviously across the country on these and similar issues? We're going to start with Sara Andrews, who's, of course, the director of the Ohio Criminal Sentencing Commission. She'll get us started, and we'll, going alphabetically, turn to Gary Daniels of the ACLU of Ohio, and we'll hear from Micah Derry from Americans for Prosperity, then turn to Andrew Geisler from the Buckeye Institute, and Kyle Strickland from the Kerwin Institute and also the Roosevelt Institute will be our final panelist, although I shouldn't say that. Alex Fraga is also going to speak a little bit about the research she's done to provide a bit of a national perspective on what we're learning about kinds of reforms that we've been talking about and debating in Ohio for now quite some time, and I think we'll continue to talk about and debate in the next hour plus. So with that, Sara, thank you for joining us today, and why don't you give us your perspective both on kind of what you've seen over the years and where you think we are right now and where we're headed.
All right, well, thank you. It's an honor to be with you this afternoon. As many of you may or may not know, the Ohio Criminal Sentencing Commission is an affiliated office of the Supreme Court of Ohio. And the commission was created in the early 1990s in response to 4 concerns: prison population and cost, overly complicated sentencing laws, racial disparity in sentencing, and lack of judicial discretion. Those probably sound pretty familiar, right? I mean, simply stated, the concerns persist. And here we are in 2021. So the commission continues to work to meet those challenges. We strive to enhance justice and ensure fair sentencing in Ohio. Our focus is not unlike other sentencing and criminal justice commissions across the country. And we're proud and fortunate to be able to work and consult with those other commissions on a regular basis. Commissions tell the story behind the data, and they illustrate the deep intricacies of sentencing patterns and trends. And our goal is to weave those patterns and trends together to inform and engage others in development of sound public policy. And I probably just made that sound really easy and simple, but the truth is that Ohio's criminal reform history is fraught with unrealized expectations, which you'll hear more about, I'm sure, from my colleagues. The reality is that we suffer from the cumulative effect of tinkering with sentencing structure on unlimited data sources and a crime-by-crime basis. And that's partly because available sentencing data focus on few outcomes, such as people sentenced to prison. The data doesn't tell us about punishments other than prison or about the process of sentencing, such as factors that influence the sentence. As Mark Miller and Ron Wright have said, the destination is important, but to understand the true dynamics of sentencing systems, so is the road. We know that long-lasting reform in criminal justice policy must be based upon more than limited circumstances, anecdotal experience, and insufficient data. The good news is that I think we have, after nearly 30 years, turned the corner and have a realistic path and strategy to advance Ohio in terms of one of my favorite 4-letter words, data. Among the modest reforms in House Bill 1, there was language in the bill to define the commission as a criminal justice agency. And defining us as a criminal justice agency essentially codifies current practice of our partnership with other agencies to collect, exchange, and analyze data that's available from those disparate systems. House Bill 1 also obligates us to study and report on the impact of the statutory changes in the bill. And this is important because when we ask ourselves, how can Ohio break out of the infinite loop of underachieving or failed reform, the answer is movement toward a data-informed environment. We've already begun the work to study the impact of House Bill 1, and we continue to encourage members of the General Assembly to include language for us to study and report on the implementation, application, and administration of legislation enacted that impacts sentencing. We're also advocating that the Commission's statutory authority be modernized to transition us to the Ohio Criminal Justice Commission. The modernization of our enabling statutes includes both changes in membership and duties. The changes in duties are robust and frankly support the indispensable role for sentencing commissions to assemble and analyze all the data about the inflows and outflows of the criminal justice system needed to make sensible cost-benefit decisions, promote smart, effective use of resources, and ensure measured, proportional responses. Sentencing data provides opportunity for powerful research, including the ability to parse comparative data between counties, and recognize that county or community standards can drive law enforcement, prosecution, and sentencing decision-making. The value of data, established baseline information, and the ability to measure implementation results can't be overstated. It's essential for future success, fundamental for true reform, and consequential for every Ohioan. To that end, we are in the early stages of movement toward a data-informed environment that allows for the comprehensive understanding and analysis of the criminal justice system. We've created a uniform sentencing entry, which is the first step to begin statewide standardized aggregate felony sentencing data collection. The implementation of the uniform sentencing entry is the foundation for what we are calling the Ohio Sentencing Data Platform. Available and searchable data transcends any one branch of government because it's the only objective way to make sure what we are doing works and is or isn't achieving the intended results. The initial development, or what we're calling the discovery phase of the Ohio Sentencing Data Platform, began in October of 2020 and includes one pilot site, one court in Allen County. It's a 2-judge court. The discovery phase of the project has been remarkably successful. In fact, it's exceeded our expectations regarding the time and the scope. Consequently, several more courts will join the project over the next few months. We're on the verge of significant, meaningful, long-term change and turning the tide on decades-long missed opportunities to better understand how felony sentencing works in Ohio. The Ohio Sentencing Data Platform will build public trust in criminal justice processes and outcomes by making sentencing data accessible. And it has been met with enthusiastic, and I'm not lying, enthusiastic interest and support from judges and courts throughout the state. We finally stopped asking why create a database or finding the reasons of why it can't be done. Instead, we're asking why not do it? And again, I'm happy to be here today and look forward to working with my esteemed colleagues on this panel to move Ohio forward in meaningful criminal justice reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And that is a very encouraging start. I have a inkling that we may not have as encouraging a message coming down the line, but without previewing too much, I think we'll turn to Gary Daniels of ACLU. If you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
Yes, perhaps my reputation precedes me, Doug. Thank you to the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for putting this together. You all have been wonderful in facilitating these types of discussions and spreading information across Ohio on what the ACLU of Ohio considers crucial issues. As mentioned, my name is Gary Daniels. I'm the chief lobbyist for the ACLU of Ohio, where I have essentially been since 1995, except for a few years when I was out of state, but then came back. And I mention this because in 25 years or so of doing this work, it provides some perspective to look back at 1995 or 2005 or any given period in time and say, well, what essentially has changed? And I've been a lobbyist for about 13 or so, full-time lobbyist for about 13 of those years. And when I look back at my career doing this work up to this point, nothing has changed, except it's gotten worse. So, everything we are doing all along with regard to, for instance, the war on drugs remains the same here in Ohio. We still subscribe to this idea that drug problems are best handled and perhaps exclusively handled through cops, courts, and cages. The idea that we should be trying something different seems to be rather an alien concept among many legislators at the State House. Indeed, today, drug possession remains the #1 reason why people end up in an Ohio prison, and drug trafficking remains the #2 reason why people end up in an Ohio prison. As part of this effort, just as a quick plug, if you go to acluohio.org/pipeline, you will see our most recent report. This is the 3rd legislative session in a row that we did it. We call it the State House to Prison Pipeline. And the idea behind it is it was born out of a certain amount of frustration because, I would sit through budget hearings and the DRC director would show up and talk about prison overcrowding, which our prisons have been overcrowded for decades, since before I started doing this work and currently. They still remain around the same levels except for COVID-19 considerations. Sitting through these hearings, talking to legislators, and they express surprise. How did our prisons get this way? Why are we putting so many people in prison? Why are we now spending at least $2 billion a year to lock people up here in Ohio? And the primary reason essentially is because the legislature continues to introduce and pass bills to put more people in prison or jail. Now, some of these are big bills that definitely and absolutely will throw more people in prison and jail and impact all of these problems that we talked about. And then there's always a whole mess of smaller bills that won't contribute individually significantly to the prison or jail population or these problems, but it becomes death by 1,000 cuts, where enough of these bills do have an impact. And this is something that the legislature does year after year, session after session. And it would certainly be helped if the legislature would pass bills that would balance this out, at least somewhat. But the problem is that we don't see a whole lot of these bills. In fact, I would say in the 13 years that I've been full-time lobbying, I have yet to see a reform bill yet. And I suppose that depends on what your definition of reform is. And the way I frame it is that what we have been doing is small R reform, not capital R reform, because those positive bills that we do, and to use this past session as an example, House Bill 1, which expands alternatives to prison and expands record sealing, House Bill 136 that exempts certain people with severe mental illnesses from the death penalty, bills about liberalizing fines and fees and reinstatement fees for suspended driver's licenses. Those are all well and good. We support those bills and we're in support of and have supported them all along. But what we don't ask as a state, for instance, is why have the death penalty at all? Although those conversations are increasing these days. Instead of tinkering around with things like intervention in lieu of conviction and record sealing and all of these other terms used in the criminal legal landscape, why do we have a war on drugs at all? When it has been, as I am fond or not so fond of saying, over the years and over the decades, by any objective measure, the war on drugs has been an absolute failure. You can still get drugs any type you want in all kinds of places for just as cheap as they have ever been. We continue to throw people now, generations of people in families, into prison, coming out with felony records, having all kinds of problems getting their lives back together. But we keep continuing to do this year after year after year. And of course, it is very frustrating for those of us working day to day with legislators or against legislators on these issues, because we can't ever seem to make any fundamental progress on these issues. And I will end by saying, so long as the legislature continues to listen exclusively or almost exclusively to certain prosecutors and judges in Ohio who maintain themselves as the experts and the sole experts on these topics, we will continue to find ourselves in this position, continuing to spend billions of dollars on things that do not work while shattering our families, our communities, our neighborhoods, and the state as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I was not wrong to anticipate we had a different perspective. And with that, that's the whole point of having these sorts of events. And I am incredibly grateful, not just for those two different perspectives, but for the timeliness as you stuck to the 5 to 8 minutes. Great job there. And now we'll turn to Micah Derry from Americans for Prosperity to give us his take on where we are and where we're going.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. And thank you for having me. We're at one of those moments right now where looking back, we will know for sure, but whether or not we're at the beginning of a watershed moment when it comes to the reform movement. As we got through the lame duck session on last General Assembly, we had a number of great, key, important victories. As we heard Sara Andrews refer to earlier about the strides that were made in House Bill 1, just simply on the data front, which is critical to being able to move forward on meaningful reform. But also, we saw some other minor bills, such as the bill that put a ban on juvenile life without parole sentencing. Something that in and of itself only impacts a handful of individuals currently in the prison system, but in and of itself also an important recognition of something being wrong with the status quo and there being a sense of a need to do something about it. Where we stand today is really the question of, do we have the opportunity to change the culture of the legislature? You heard Gary just a moment ago talking about the severe impact of year after year after year of having the legislature introduce and pass more and more bills. In fact, in November of last year, the Legislative Service Commission, the nonpartisan agency that writes the legislation for the General Assembly and also does some research projects at the behest of legislators, released a research paper that tracked from 1974 through 2020 the growth of felonies within the Ohio Revised Code. When that report came out, it showed a couple things that I can't say were surprising other than the sheer volume. See, back in 1974, the Ohio Revised Code had a grand total of 146 felonies in it, 146. In 2020, at the time of the release of that research paper, that had grown to a staggering 752 felonies. Now, the drug chapter, chapter 2925 of the Ohio Revised Code, that had grown from just an even 50 felonies all the way up to 197 felonies on drug offenses alone. That's 396% of growth from 1974 to 2020. And perhaps the most disappointing part about that trend is the fact that report coming out in November had to be revised in February because in December, the Ohio legislature created 3 more felonies and the total number had to be revised to reflect that. So if that's where we sit right now, then the question is, while we are passing good legislation, and we're trying to stem the tide of the bad, where do we stand with as a culture in the legislature? And I think that part of what's telling is actually playing out right now in the Ohio Senate on a bill that in and of itself is of very little consequence, perhaps, other than it's a bad bill. And that's Senate Bill 25. Senate Bill 25 is currently in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it already passed the General Assembly last year as Senate Bill 55. While it passed both chambers with bipartisan support, it ultimately ended up vetoed, ironically, because of COVID amendments that ended up in the bill, and the governor wasn't willing to sign it. So he vetoed the bill, and now it's coming back again. Now, this bill in of itself, what it does is something that is a great example of the political impetus that goes behind much of this legislation. The bill in and of itself, what it does is it creates an enhancement zone, a drug-free zone of 1,000-foot radius around drug treatment centers in Ohio. Now, understanding this from the perspective of the legislators, they look at this as this is to help protect people that are recovering. The bill sponsor herself, Senator Gavarone, says it is to create a safety bubble around addicts who are in recovery. Now, for myself, as someone who's 11 years clean from opiates, I can certainly acknowledge the intent and the good intentions that are behind that bill. However, as we already know from drug-free school zones, that kind of geographic zone often has unintended consequences that has led to other states, including Tennessee and Utah and Indiana and Illinois, all working to roll back their geographic zones and the enhancements underneath it, particularly after Nashville discovered that 24% of the Nashville city limits were within these enhancement zones. To only double down on what I think we can argue has been a mediocrely successful, if not outright failure of a policy with the school drug-free zones, to double down on that around drug treatment centers really asks the very serious question. And for those that have consistently fought against such legislation, such as Gary Daniels from the ACLU, as well as others, can tell you that having a pause to stop and actually begin to ask questions. And it's partially because we have some great partners in the legislature, particularly looking at the Senate Judiciary Chair, Senator Nathan Manning, who has fortunately taken a pause to say, let's review this. And this is someone who's already even on the record having voted for the bill in the past. As legislators begin to pause and to actually look at data, and that's the key, to actually look at data and to not just give knee-jerk political measures to respond to what we can all agree are very real problems in our state. If that is happening, then maybe we're turning the tide. I think we're going to learn a lot in this General Assembly. You see, we had some great champions in the form of Senate President Larry Obhoff and also the former Judiciary Chair, John Eklund, who have both been term limited. And with them being out of the legislature, without those particular champions at the helm, it's time for new champions to step up. And the question is, can we maintain and grow momentum around things that we've seen in the last several years, including civil asset forfeiture, including House Bill 1, the sealing of records? Can we move past that and go from the lowercase r reforms that Gary talks about to the capital R reforms? Right now, I think we're going to find out in the near future. And it's all going to determine on people who, whether we have our careers working in this space, or if it's folks who are activists that are, again, known quantities, or if it's even folks that simply have enough interest to join in on a Wednesday afternoon on a Zoom webinar. What are we going to do to build that momentum? We saw last year, all too painfully, the awareness that is around the problems we have in our criminal justice system, as people joined down here in Columbus to have 10,000 people out in the streets, marching up all the way up High Street and coming back down 3rd. I mean, my wife and I were part of that. How do we go from that to carry that energy into the legislature? And it requires people having thoughtful, meaningful conversations. So how do we get here? Where are we right now? And where does it go from here? That depends on what people who are sitting on the sidelines step up and do. And for those that are already engaged, do we take losses like what we had on Senate Bill 3 last year, lying down? And do we give up? Or do we keep on moving, keep on raising awareness, doubling down on our data collection, our research, and making sure that our lawmakers understand the real implications? I don't know if it's a good message or a bad message yet, but we'll know soon.
Thank you so much, Micah. And it's the perfect message. I really appreciate that. And thank you for sharing your perspective and the work that you've been doing as well. We'll now turn to Andrew Geisler of the Buckeye Institute to do the same.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Berman, and thanks to everyone with the DPC for organizing this and having me here today. I really appreciate the effort that went into being here, and thanks to everyone who's here and is interested in these issues. As was mentioned, I'm a legal fellow at the Buckeye Institute. The Buckeye Institute is a public policy research institution, a think tank that exists to promote good public policy in the states. We specifically do a lot of work on, economic type issues and things like that, but my particular area of focus is criminal justice policy. And the way that we think about criminal justice policy and all of our work in general is that we're seeking to really remove barriers to opportunity for folks that are keeping them from living meaningful lives, from having the sorts of opportunities to, engage in society in the way that they should, and trying to remove those barriers wherever we can. So we've been, over the last 7 or 8 years, real advocates and sort of policy experts on comprehensive criminal justice reform in Ohio and in sort of in the states generally. As has been discussed, there have been a number of sort of marginal quality reforms over the last 7 to 8 years, things like mens rea reform, so criminal intent reform, things like civil asset forfeiture reform, the TCAP program that keeps felony 5 offenders out of prison that is operating in 60 of 88 counties. There, we have an expansion of eligibility for intervention in lieu of conviction. We have record sealing reforms that have sort of come into place. So a number of reforms that are making some difference in this direction. But I think everybody on this panel, it was sort of largely, not to speak for everyone, I'm sorry, but was largely disappointed that Senate Bill 3 ultimately failed last session. And, the Buckeye Institute has been a huge advocate of drug sentencing reform in general, partially because of just, as has been discussed, the cost of prisons is astronomical, right? We're looking at $2 billion for our DRC budget over the time. But then also this idea of the need to remove barriers to opportunity for folks who are carrying around the collateral consequences of of felonies and are having a really hard time meaningfully rebuilding their lives after they've struggled with addiction. So we advocated aggressively for Senate Bill 3 and for drug sentencing reform with the hope of giving those people a meaningful opportunity to find work, a meaningful opportunity to not carry those collateral consequences around for the rest of their lives. And unfortunately, I think we saw Senate Bill 3 ultimately die sort of on the vine at the end of the lame duck session, largely due to some local pressure and some pressure from high level, state government officials and things like that. I think other issues that we ran into as we worked through Senate Bill 3 was even the anchoring point of issue 1 in the fact that issue 1 was sort of voted down so resoundingly with the public in the 2018 election. And a number of elected officials, quite frankly, just didn't understand, and this is something we can certainly unpack later, the differences between Senate Bill 3 and issue 1. I think that became a real issue, but it's sad that Senate Bill 3 went down because of the great opportunity it had to give people that opportunity to find a way to rebuild their life after they completed treatment, after all those sorts of things happened. Then we've instead sort of left this gap where House Bill 1 does a good job of saying, more people can be diverted into intervention in lieu of conviction on the front end. You can seal your record 5 years later. Those are very good things, but we have a 5-year sort of period where people are still struggling with these sort of crippling collateral consequences of a felony. So I think that in terms of future reforms, there are a number of things that we can do in the future to kind of achieve the goals of keeping people out of prison for offenses that we don't think they should necessarily be in prison for. But I think the missed opportunity was on that collateral consequence piece in particular, and that opportunity to really reclassify all of those offenses just would have made such a huge difference for so many folks. So before I can yield the rest of my time, I'll just throw out a few things that I think are good future reform areas that we can look at that will kind of work on this prison population area, the recidivism rates and some of those things. So one is to make the TCAP program mandatory. Like I said, it operates in 60 of 88 counties. We're not sending felony 5 offenders to prison. And there's really no reason at this point, after we've seen the success of that program, to not extend it to all of our counties. Another is to look at collateral sanctions, not collateral consequences, but collateral sanctions in the revised code, and try and find ways to eliminate those collateral sanctions wherever we can, wherever it makes sense for folks to sort of remove those kinds of barriers. Another is bail reform, which is a really exciting area that there's some momentum behind in the state currently and hasn't been discussed before. There's some opponents of Senate Bill 3, there are proponents of bail reform, so real opportunity there. Another thing that Sara talked about, and I think everybody's touched on in some ways, is the record keeping and the data. The fact that we're flying blind on so many of these policy areas is a real struggle in terms of educating legislators, talking with the general public even, and having people sort of understand what the need is to do some of these things. And finally, the last thing that I think is a real opportunity and was a part of issue 1, although could be handled differently even in legislation, is just to do some kind of earned credit expansion to sort of help with recidivism rates. Ohio is really, really low nationally, with allowing people to only earn back like 8 or 10% of their time in prison. So there's a number of things that we can do that might still be small R reforms in Gary's formulation, but I think are still worth doing, worth pressing forward on. And it's always worth beating the drum for the bigger things like the large scale drug sentencing reform that we came so close on, and we'd love to see come back around in some form for sure. But I think there's still more things that we can do that'll continue to remove these barriers to opportunity that exist for folks. And I look forward to the discussion with everybody else the rest of the time. Thanks so much to everybody for being here again.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And again, we're staying wonderfully on time. We'll have time for the Q&A, and I see a few questions have come up in that forum. So rest assured, folks, we'll have time to get to those. But first, we've got Kyle Strickland to kind of round out our invited panelists, and then we'll hear from Alex as well right at the end. But Kyle's with the Kirwan Institute and the Roosevelt Institute, and I know has been working on a range of these issues for quite some time as well. So the floor is yours, Kyle.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, Doug. Thanks so much to the Drug Enforcement Policy Center for having me. Excited to join these panelists today. My comments are probably going to reflect a little bit closer to Gary's opening comments in terms of my optimism or lack thereof as it relates to our state legislature when it comes to criminal justice reform here in Ohio. Just a bit of background. I work at the Kirwan Institute as senior legal analyst here. We look at these lenses of race and justice, looking at both the intersection of bias and how that plays a role in sentencing disparities over time, as well as the war on drugs and the system of mass incarceration. I'm also at the Roosevelt Institute, just recently joined as the Deputy Director of Race and Democracy, where we're a nonprofit think tank to to the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And our focus is really on making sure that the economy and democracy works for the good of all. And I am also speaking in a more personal capacity today to give me a little bit more real estate for this conversation. Because we have to be honest, when we're talking about criminal justice reform in Ohio, this is not an issue that is just siloed on the side. And the reason why I say that is because when we talk about racial equity, racial justice, too often we talk about that as it is siloed, as it is a separate issue, not connected and related to other factors as it relates to the systems, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's our education system, our economy. All those issues are impacted. And so racial equity is not just a criminal justice reform issue. And criminal justice is not just in that corner because it impacts so much about our everyday well-being. The facts are that I will not remain optimistic. You know, I am pleased by the small incremental reforms that have happened here in Ohio. But what I'm concerned about is the much larger efforts to undermine everything that we're trying to do. And the facts are that as much as the data in the world that we can get, which is certainly the right direction that we need to take, so long as we continue to have a state legislature that is predominantly run by folks who are anti-science, are not swayed by data, are not swayed by facts, and are actually pulled into the direction of extremism, that is actually not reflective of most Ohioans. It's not reflective of most Ohioans. Then we are not going to see the criminal justice reform that we need in this country. No facts, no science, no data is going to change their opinion. We already know, as Gary mentioned at the beginning, the war on drugs has been a complete failure. The attempts around issue 1 to make some significant expansions and reforms to our criminal justice system, you had people come out against it and say, well, you know, I'm opposed to it because of it's a constitutional amendment. And instead, this is something that should be done through the state legislature. That was a nice attempt that lasted for a very strong effort with SB 3, but ultimately did make it to the vote in the House. And we see why this continues to happen. And it will continue to happen until we address these issues, not just in silos. And so I think it's important, especially when we have conversations about criminal justice reform, we also have to talk about the legislatures who are in power right now. We have to talk about, we cannot have this conversation without talking about redistricting. We cannot have this conversation without talking about the fact that we have continued to see a gutting of our public programs and our social safety net here in Ohio and abroad. And that is continuing to hurt the material conditions that people are in, which then perpetuates a cycle of inequality, cycles of poverty, and then gets people into a cycle of a criminal justice system that decides to spend more time on punishing people than providing them with the treatment and support that they need. And so for us to actually do this, we need to start speaking truth to power and recognizing, even within our own institutions, where are we failing as it relates to these issues. I love the bipartisan, cross-ideological supports that we can get when it comes to criminal justice reform. I think it's so critical. I think it is necessary in order for us to move forward. However, I also want others to realize and recognize that other policies that you might be advocating for that have traditionally not been in the criminal justice reform space, such as, you know, gutting social safety net programs and expecting things to trickle down to the rest of us, that hurts us all. That hurts everybody. And so we have to figure out ways in which we can come together and really address these issues and at least move away from the extremism that we see in our legislature today. That requires redistricting. It requires bold policies, bold reforms. And of course, in many cases, the most promising efforts as it comes to reform right now is at the federal level, because we have those who are in place and in power who are willing to move away from the status quo of incarceration as a solution to all of our problems. But I hope we can get there, and we're just hopefully moving the right step in the right direction. Excited for the conversation and the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And, you know, it's sort of a reminder of how many contexts these conversations necessarily have to tap into, and that there's not just the inevitability that we get siloed in aspects of what we look at and the topics we focus on, but that sometimes there's just so much information, it's hard to sort of keep it all together. And that's where, you know, I feel proud that the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center is eager to advance knowledge with context. I'll put in a plug for the resource page that we've developed that provides context, particularly on this drug sentencing reform and the range of criminal justice bills. You've heard a lot of them from so many of our incredibly informed and engaged panelists. And so look there if you want some more context as well. And this is where it's an introduction for me to Alex, our senior researcher, who's been not only providing context for the center and helping us to put that resource page together, but is a reminder, as a few panelists also talked about, that we can learn from some other states. Kyle mentioned as well the federal system. There are so many ways in which the Ohio story and reform efforts are embedded, not just in a range of issues, but within a nation that has parallel states working on these issues, and then has the federal government that at times can be helpful, at times can be distracting or harmful to reform efforts. And so with that even broadened lens in mind, I'll kick it to Alex to both talk a little bit about some of the research she gathered and has helped summarize for our resource page and for the benefit of discussion of this audience. And then I think I'll queue up a question as well for general discussion, and then I'll also after that turn to the Q&A, make sure I pick up some of the themes that have been articulated by some of our attendees, and I'm grateful for their engagement. So with that, go ahead, Alex.
Sure. Hi, my name is Alex Frega. I'm a senior research associate with DPC. I'm going to speak briefly a little bit about some of what we know from other states. First, with regards to crime rates, states that have institutionalized defelonization reform tend to see drops in rearrest and reconviction rates on the whole. One exception of this is Utah. Utah actually experienced a rise in recidivism rates amongst low-level drug offenders and chronic drug offenders. Important to note, however, is the Utah initiative fell short on a number of its treatment goals, sort of highlighting the necessity of pairing defelonization with treatment alternatives. We also know from other states that prison populations decline with defelonization. States save a considerable amount of money. And with that, I'll queue up our first question to the panel, which is what can we learn about the failure of SB3, and also what can we learn from criminal justice reform in Ohio over the last decade?
Some of you have all talked about that, but partially either in response to any of the other panelists and what they've spoken about, or if you think there's maybe it's a political message, or I think I heard Andrew at one point say, that maybe too many legislators looked at SB3 as just like issue one, and we're sort of thinking about those things in lockstep. Is that a failure of messaging from advocates? Is that a failure of legislators from taking the time to understand these matters better? I'm particularly interested in sort of political, social, lessons about the process of reform, given that there seemed to be such relative optimism that SB3 could get to the finish line.
Professor, if I can speak to that a little bit, the final weeks of the General Assembly in December, had elements around SB3, the kind of things that you typically would see in a constructed drama, and the way it unfolded was incredibly unfortunate. Kyle spoke to it earlier in talking about the leaders that we have. The fact is, we had the votes. The majority of the Republican caucus were poised to vote yes on Senate Bill 3. And ultimately, it came down to one leader's decision, and that was Speaker Bob Cupp. Speaker Bob Cupp chose to not hold the vote on the bill. I mean, that's the matter of fact. Now, to be fair as well, though, the previous speaker, Larry Householder, who is now under indictment for RICO charges, in which half of the co-conspirators have already pled guilty, he wouldn't have put it up for a vote either. And he told lobbyists as much. So the lessons to learn, having the vote sometimes isn't enough. And I think that we certainly learned a lot of lessons along the way. Kyle again referred to the folks that voted no on issue one on the basis of constitutional amendment, and I was one of them. I voted against issue one, partially because I had helped staff on the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission, and I had seen what an absolute impossibility it is to get rid of antiquated portions of the Constitution that have no bearing on our state today. And I know how difficult it is to make changes to something once in the Constitution. So yeah, I doubt it. But man, when we get to the legislative process and we try to do it right, we run into realities such as one person can change the outcome altogether. So I think the most important lesson is to take a lot of the messaging we had around SB3, retool it and bring it back. And also, I'll say this as well, part of where some of my optimism lies is as we've been meeting with freshman legislators, and there's nearly 30 of them in the House. It's a young class of freshmen. It's one of the realities of term limits. A lot of these incoming members are young, and there is definitely a generational mentality around crime and punishment, being tough on crime. And for the younger members, there seems to be a really refreshing realization that we have to change the way we've been doing things. Probably the most critical thing as we look at Simple 3 and whatever new iteration is brought forward is to remember that to view it as a partisan issue is a massive mistake. And we got into this problem through both Republican and Democrat control. I mean, half of the felonies on the books right now were created under Speaker Vern Reif, under Democratic control back in the 80s and early 90s. If we understand that this is an us problem, this is everybody, and we try to address it similarly, and again, to what Sara Andrews led us off in talking about the importance of the data, if we put data at the center of our messages, and we wrap around that the personal stories that are very, very present in our communities, and the advocates are leading with that combined message, I'm optimistic we will get there. It might still take time, though.
Such interesting comments. I'm going to try to sort of roll in some of the Q&A questions that I've noticed and pose this to some of the other panelists as well. Anybody can jump in as they see fit. Noticing the bipartisan nature of these conversations, and also hearing your point about sort of generational shift. I certainly have experienced that, teaching now for long enough that I've seen a generation of law students and much more progressive anti-incarcerative attitudes, even among younger people that we see these days. And it's maybe, we can all take credit for having educated people more and more on these issues, so there's just a lot more understanding. But a lot of the comments in the Q&A are speaking to, who do we focus the change on? How do we change the legislators? We have term limits that's supposed to do that. It sounds like it's encouraging that it does that to some degree. But whether it's prosecutors, whether it's judges, not subject to the same kinds of limitations. Should the reform-minded voters spend all their time trying to find out how old the different candidates are and support the younger ones and think that's the way to do it rather than think about party affiliation? Are there other facets that you all think are especially critical, for getting the right leaders in place that, will want to make change on these issues, or B, not giving up on the leaders we have? What can motivate them to look at these issues differently, or sort of, what you might even say is, go from the little R reform to the big R reform that Gary spoke of early? Is there a secret sauce here, or is it something that's going to take, years, if not decades, to just continue to move people over time? Go ahead, Gary.
I suspect it will take time, because these things always do, and they are always multi-layered with many variables. I do choose to remain actually optimistic for many of the reasons people have talked about. Certainly the leadership of the Criminal Sentencing Commission, Chief Justice O'Connor, and other judges with regard to getting data collection of the type that we have never had here in Ohio. That would be absolutely fantastic. It's been a gigantic frustration for so many of us for so many years. But I wonder if it will ultimately change anything, because when some of us do have the data that we have in the studies that we have, and we go to lawmakers with it, they don't exactly say, oh, well, you've got all the data now, let's actually change these things. And a little bit of polite pushback on Kyle's comments, because as the person who had to research the 1,194 bills introduced last session to see which ones passed, which ones did not, what the partisan breakdown was on introduction and voting for them, it's a bipartisan problem. It truly is that both sides. Now, the issues might be a little bit different. The Democrats seem to favor, when you're talking about upping criminal penalties, bills having to do with such things as gun control, or domestic violence, prostitution, which is a very bipartisan issue to up penalties on. And so, while the issues might not be exactly the same, and I think Democrats are generally more attuned to the problems with the war on drugs, when it comes down to the votes, oftentimes don't match the rhetoric, which is a very real problem, because it's only the votes that count. So when people want to talk about what should be done and what's working and what's not working, those votes are very important. And finally, I'll just say, we need to all collectively do a better job of getting impacted people before legislators and stakeholders, so they can explain firsthand the problems that they have had with the criminal legal system, the war on drugs, and what have you. And this also includes, I see in the Q&As, people asking very thoughtful questions and making statements about, apparently there's treatment professionals and other people expressing their own frustrations about this and what is and is not working. Those people, however they can do it, I know, capacity is always an issue, but legislators are not hearing from them either. So these issues that they are bringing up in the Q&A about the problems with drug treatment and how it's applied and who it's applied to and whether it's effective or not and all these other things, that is something legislators need to hear as well.
So this is with some of Kyle's remarks in mind, and I'll direct this to you, Kyle, although Andrew, if you have thoughts on this frontier as well, because sort of thinking about it, and it really harkens me back to what was a depressing takeaway focused on the federal system 20 years ago, when there was continued debate over the crack powder sentencing distinction and the obvious data showing these dramatic racial disparities in the sentences being received at the federal level for crack offenders versus powder cocaine offenders. There were a number of staffers. One wrote a wonderful, depressing article for the Federal Sentencing Reporter saying, this is obviously a racialized issue with such incredible racial impact. That's why we have to deal with it. And then she went on to say, and that's why we shouldn't be talking about race, because as soon as the conversation focuses on race, it polarizes certain political players and actually makes it harder to have a reform conversation than if we talk and center the discourse on other issues. Among the reasons that comes to mind is one of my takeaways from these summer's protests is a bold statement, an important statement from the people saying, no, these conversations need to be centered on race. It may make people uncomfortable. It may make it that much more challenging, but all the more reason we need to be constantly attentive to the way that race infects so many aspects of our criminal justice system and our structures more generally, as you mentioned. But again, thinking both for you and for Andrew, for this General Assembly, given how it's been elected, given how gerrymandering and a range of other factors shape who's actually in charge, is there still a frustrating and discouraging risk that if you center the conversation on race, you make it less likely that progress moves forward than more likely?
So great question, Doug. I think that's something all of us are kind of wrestling with, especially in a place like Ohio, which, contrary to Governor DeWine's assertion, is not a progressive state. And one of the things that I want to be clear about is that has been the ideology for a while, both Democrats and Republicans. This idea that we shouldn't talk about race because it's such a divisive issue that the second you bring it up, then it turns people away. And we know that in some cases that is true, where, for example, if you talk about the white racial attitudes around, let's say public programs, right? So welfare programs, the more that they realize that people of color benefit from these programs, the less interested they are in receiving those programs, even if that also helps them. The reason, though, that we need to talk about race is because when we avoid talking about race, what happens then is the dog whistle politics and sometimes the even bullhorn politics of utilizing race and racism. It's important for those to have the language and the ability to talk about race. The facts are that when we talk about race and racism in this country and in this state, this is not some zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. The fact is, racism hurts all of us, regardless of your background. And for us to have this conversation, we need to understand to be able to talk about race and racism in a way that people can understand and get, and that is not zero sum. Because when we choose not to speak about it, then these dog whistles happen. And then what you have, to Gary's point, you have people across ideological spectrums voting and supporting issues that disproportionately harm and impact people that they may claim to support and believe in, simply because they are not aware of the racialized effects and the racialized impacts. We have to be front and center talking about the race forward impacts and effects, and talking about racial justice, admitting and recognizing that systemic racism is an issue in this country and in this state. And you admitting that does not mean then that somehow we should not have any language around race and racism. The fact is that it impacts every single aspect of our domains. We just need to have a better job talking about it. And the way we start doing that is by, one, raising awareness, and two, making clear that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And in fact, you have certain politicians who use racism as a weapon and weaponize it against Black, brown, and white people that hurts all of us. And so we can talk about this in a way that centers race. Not everybody's going to be comfortable in doing so, but we have to be strategic and start moving and normalizing that conversation.
I don't have too much to add to what was just said, but I will say, in general, when you're thinking about criminal justice issues, you can't run from the obvious racial justice implications of those issues, right? And it's just not, if you're seriously talking about these issues, if you're seriously dealing with this policy area, then I think you're talking about those implications. And it's not something that you can just sort of hide the ball on for the reasons of making people feel more or less comfortable, right? So that would just be my 2 cents.
Thank you. Well, I have a accentuate the positive question for Sara in a little while, but I want Alex to have a chance to jump in and ask a question, or if she sees anything in the Q&A she wants to make sure we get to.
Yeah, I want to pull from one of the Q&A questions is about COVID and sort of what ways COVID might create kind of a unique moment for criminal justice reform. So I want to ask that also in tandem with kind of thinking forward about what is next.
I can kick that off. I mentioned I choose to be optimistic. One of the reasons that I remain also pessimistic, if I can walk that balance. Again, 1,194 bills introduced last session. 0, not a single one, addressed the problem of COVID-19 in our prison system, where I think at the last count, 133 or 134 people have died inside, as well as 10 staff members. From literally the point COVID-19 emerged as a concern and we knew it was going to be serious, ACLU of Ohio, among other organizations, have really been trying to bird dog this issue. I mean, we did everything but get on our hands and knees and beg Governor DeWine, officials at DRC and others, legislators, to do something about this issue. Because, I don't know how many of those deaths could have been avoided, because we know prisons are not set up for pandemics. Prisons are the opposite of the absolute opposite of how you deal with a pandemic. You can't social distance, healthcare is not great, et cetera, et cetera. But Ohio is near the top for the number of people who have become infected in prison and who have died in prison as a result. And I don't know how many of these deaths would have been avoidable, but certainly some of them, and perhaps many of them, would have been if legislators and the governors would have actually treated this seriously, but they have not. And the reason why, the plain fact is, the reason why so many people have died in our prison system is because of the inaction of Ohio legislators, politicians, and elected officials.
My positive sort of spin for Sara, and this is just to get you involved, but also to talk about the work that I know your commission is already getting started on. My sense is HB1 has ended up being sort of perceived not exactly like the forgotten stepchild, but not that big a deal, because darn it, we didn't get SB3, and to me, there's two really interesting lessons here, and I think we've seen it sort of a parallel story at the federal level as well. When there are robust efforts at reform, it can sometimes make space for more incremental reforms to not only seem modest, but to almost get forgotten as to what they might achieve and where they might be headed. And then the related piece of that, we've certainly seen this with the First Step Act as one variation at the federal level. My sense is it'll be true at the HB1 level, and we've seen it with a bunch of Ohio reform through the years. Ultimately, how a reform gets implemented is as important, if not more important, than what the particulars of the reform are. And so I know your commission is sort of starting up work on tracking HB1, and that's part of your mandate. But I wonder if you just have a perspective on what you think the potential of that is, and then bring in any other panelists who want to speak to that as well, as to are we not quite sleeping on the optimism that might be there? Are there opportunities to take what did get passed, and my understanding is with almost no opposition, to leverage that into still pretty significant change in the state?
Well, it's funny that I'm the Pollyanna of the group, but I'll take it. I think that you hit it right on the head, that implementation is the key, and that's what we've missed in the past, right? We've done all these incremental piling on of reform efforts and really haven't assessed if they're working before we do something more or change it and add another one. And so, yeah, I mean, it may seem like it's not a whole lot, but it really is, because it gives us a chance and a voice to circle back to say, this, the intended outcome was X, but it didn't follow through. And that's my Great Dane Cooper. I almost made it. So we're looking forward to being able to really articulate where the intended changes have missed the mark and how we could do better. I mean, we already, the commission has advocated for years that we need to reduce the administrative complexity of the statutory code, and we haven't done that in either of those provisions that are in House Bill 1. Well, two of the provisions anyway, the intervention, little conviction, and record sealing. So we probably have an opportunity to ease that administrative burden of applying those laws. And then, secondly, I think it gives us an opportunity to manage expectations and really talk about what reform is to all of us. We all say reform, but it probably means something different from each one of our vantage points. And the more we can collectively group together and move a conversation forward, I think the more successful we'll be.
Any other comments on HB1 specifically? Anybody want to drill into that, or just give us something for all of us to be keeping an eye on as that plays out? And then I'll give Alex a chance to ask one more question, and then I've got a kind of a closing one as we get toward the end of our time together.
Yeah, I didn't have one queued up, Doug, if you don't mind taking this next one.
No problem at all. So here's kind of, not quite a conclusion, but maybe each of you could speak to this, and I'll preview it and give you a second to give it some thought. What's the sleeper out there, or is there a sleeper? Is there something that, folks who work in this space, or even those who don't, may not be thinking about as much as you're thinking about it? And I'll even give you sort of my take across two dimensions, right? One is kind of a follow-up to the COVID story. I think we still don't know really what's next, right? Not only what's next in terms of, hopefully we are finally actually turning the corner on the dynamics, of the disease, but whether we think we need to revamp the way we do prisons, whether we need to revamp the way we do treatment, right? I mean, that's a couple of the Q&As was talking about how do we get clinicians and people who are real experts in drug treatment and mental health involved. And I suspect if we had a panel of those individuals, they tell you 10 different ways in which COVID has changed their world and changed the population. The other related piece of that, and this is the one that has me, nervous, maybe the wrong word, but we've seen an indisputable uptick in homicides across the country. We've seen shootings, both locally and nationwide, increase as well. Interestingly, property crimes are down, and so you can tell a variety of complicated stories about the way in which crime has changed in 2020, and it's in the short term, very easy to say, well, that's just a COVID blip, whatever that means. But I think if there is continued increases in homicide rates, there will be continued eagerness for some people to turn that into a, okay, reform's already gone too far. Time to go back to the old way of thinking. And even one of the Q&A questions highlighted a crime committed by somebody released early in another state, and those are just so salient that I'm worried, or at least keeping an eye on the way crime rates and the way those might get leveraged in the political discourse could change things. But then the other one that for me is not quite a sleeper because people are paying attention to it. Kyle even mentioned it, but what a new federal administration might do, especially in terms of incentivizing the states, right? So, Joe Biden on the campaign trail, now President Biden said, nobody should go to prison simply for drug use. They should go to mandatory treatment. Okay, if there was actually funding to operationalize that at the state level, that would blow all of our minds, I think, and what that might look like is fascinating to even speculate. I doubt there will be an effort to sort of federalize that statement, but I would just love to hear from any or all of you, kind of what is on your mind as we look forward that could not only kind of impact the way these reform discussions play out in the state, but that anybody who wants to be attentive to the direction of these discussions just needs to have an eye on, for fear that it could radically change things, because we know that's always on the horizon. So love any thoughts on that kind of wrap up question as we have about 8 or 9 minutes to close up. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So how about I'll make you go first, Kyle.
Of course. So, there's a lot of things I think at play. I think right now we cannot think about any of this issue without thinking about the context of everything that happened this past summer, and the fact that we are in a moment where multiracial coalitions kind of across the ideological spectrum are thinking that we have to change the way in which we imagine community safety and what that means. And we are not quite there yet in terms of the worldview that understands that, incarceration and punishment to all of our problems is not the way to go. But I think more and more people are realizing that we need to put less emphasis on punishment, more emphasis on treatment and support, on broader community health. That is something that resonates across the political spectrum. The problem is the disconnect between everyday people, everyday Ohioans, everyday Americans, and extremists that are in positions of power, and especially electeds, who continue to support these arcane policies to hold on to their political power, and to continue to divide. And it's deeply problematic. They use these tactics as a divide and conquer tactic. They use the tactic to drive fear. And so what you see, and we even see a couple of mentions in the chat where you'll use maybe anecdotal moments of maybe just the scariest types of things, and then cast aspersions then on the criminal justice system more broadly, and that you just need to lock people up and throw the key away. That has not worked. That has not worked, and that will not work, and that is not a humane way to deal with these issues. I think one of the more promising, we didn't talk about too much, is the surprising bipartisan push here in Ohio around ending the death penalty. That is a start, right? Like, we need to move in that direction. Hopefully we make more federal steps as well. In Illinois, the move to just end cash bail, right? There are steps that are being made, but it requires all of us to really level set with the dynamics of where we are. We also can't have this conversation without thinking about what happened on January 6th. The facts are that there is an extremism brewing and continuing to brew that has been stoked and continued on. That's not reflective on most of us. And so we've got to make sure that this doesn't continue on. And so we've got to make sure we're doing everything we can to build coalitions and to move in the right direction. I'm optimistic, more so at a federal level, but I do think we can get there slowly but surely.
Thank you, Kyle. And I think I know Andrew's worked on bail, so that may have warmed his heart as well. But you're next alphabetically if you want to pick up on that theme or any others.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Professor Byrne, one thing that you threw out that I was thinking of, and I'm maybe not the best person at finding hidden gems or things like that, but as somebody who works a lot on the details of the policy and these kinds of things, I think that the vast kind of agreement and understanding that a lot of the drug sentencing issues really are sort of medical issues that where people need treatment, right? Like that, the bridge that is being built, I think, in people's minds between the idea of somebody being a drug possessor, having that on their record, and the idea that what they really need is treatment. That's a really big change that I think has happened with sort of a lot of people. I mean, if you think about Senate Bill 3 has had the presumption of treatment. Issue 1 didn't have like a presumption of treatment on the sentence level, right? So I think that was a huge thing that we would talk a lot about Senate Bill 3, and I think a lot of people understood that that was a necessity. People maybe felt that there was the need for a felony to be hanging over someone's head, or things like that we would have disagreed with as well. But it usually wasn't, oh, the treatment, you're wrong. That intellectually is not sort of what people need. And I think as our prison population continues to be around like 5,000 or 6,000 above what it should be, even down from where it was even a year ago or so at 11,000 over, people are kind of consistently rethinking the way that we treat folks that really are sort of nonviolent offenders, really don't need any kind of incarceration time, things like that. And I think that's a really positive development, is something that I just think, even as we talk to legislators and as we talk to folks, that's something that people seem to understand, that treatment should be the center as we think about these drug sentencing discussions. And that's really important, is not something to be missed, for sure. And on bail, since you teed it up, I'll also say, the idea of having bail be like a proxy for safety and all of these sorts of things that have been such a big part of the conversation. I think that we can sort of knock down some of those arguments in a similar kind of way, that there's no reason to keep people in jail before their trial if they pose no threat to society, these kinds of things. If we think that they're going to show up to their trial, why are we sort of locking them up before they've had any kind of conviction, even before they've been charged with anything, right? Some of these kinds of situations. So there's a clear connection here where we're just not thinking, oh, we have to incarcerate everyone or have everybody sort of be in jail all the time at every turn. It's more thinking about, how can we save money here? How can we act more justly here? And I think those are both areas that people continue to develop ideas, and we see a lot of good progress on that, even if we didn't get SB 3 across the finish line.
Such enjoyable positivity. I'm enjoying that. I don't know if Michael will mess us up as we work our way through our final lightning round.
Yeah, AFP is working diligently on cash bail alongside ACLU and Buckeye, as well as a number of other organizations. The one that I would actually point out that I think is a deep sleeper, it came up during the last budget cycle and it demands more of our attention, is the state of public defense in Ohio. There was an incredible awakening for many legislators, discovering for the first time ever that in Gideon versus Wainwright, that the determination was made by the Supreme Court that states were responsible for providing the public defense. And I talked to former Attorney General Jim Petro because he had recollection of that time period, because he was a brand new legislator in the aftermath of that. And he talked about how the state made a mistake and it punted on the issue by saying that, well, the state will pay for 50% and the counties will pay the other 50% of public defense. And in the meanwhile, what happened between when that happened in the 70s up to this last budget cycle, the state averaged in the high 20% in reimbursement, which is a massive embarrassment. And when you consider that we're talking about a constitutional right under the 6th Amendment, that we are entitled as American citizens to a defense, a competent defense before a court, that's a problem. We have an imbalance between prosecutors and defenses. And as long as judges are able to have any say whatsoever over what defense attorneys are appearing before their docket, representing the defendants, we're going to have a misaligned incentive. And we're going to continue to see what currently is happening, where 94% of cases never even go to trial and instead end up either being dismissed or, more commonly, in plea bargains. And that continues to give the incentives to prosecutors to stack charges, whether they can actually prove them or not. And particularly as we continue to talk about the proliferation of felonies, this is not just a misalignment of incentives, it is leading to mass incarceration levels that we have never seen before in our history. And frankly, the world hasn't seen, especially not in a country that would proclaim itself to be the leader of the free world. We have to change that. I see legislators beginning to awaken to some of these realizations. I think there's still a lot of confusion over what to do about it. And so again, I think that the potential is there. It continues advocates, including those that are on this panel, those that have joined today to observe and to ask. I've read a number of these questions. I wish we could go on because there's some great questions in there. It takes everybody continuing to work diligently on this stuff and to have open conversations, including people who disagree with them, because we're never going to win if we contribute. Kyle talked about it, the incredibly deep divide that's present. If we do not help be the solution to that, and understand that there are people who disagree with us and who use different language than we do. We're all speaking English, but different language, different words, we mean different things. If we don't embrace that and work really hard to understand people are coming at from a different angle, we're not going to win this. But if that is the approach we have a great future.
A great final sentiment, unless Gary or Sarah are trying to jump in with their last great perspective, please feel free to do so.
I'll be very brief, Doug. Again, choose to remain optimistic here at the end of the program. As others have said, if we could get bail reform, death penalty off the books, and good data collection here in Ohio, that would be, I think, more giant than the combined 25 years that I've been doing this work at the ACLU of Ohio. We could have that in one session. So it's going to take all of us and more to do it. Everybody, please be impatient about this. Let's not be talking about how the war on drugs is still around 25 years from now. So ACLU of Ohio will certainly be doing its part.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. And Sarah, I know you're working so hard on the data collection frontier. You're happy to say something about that, or just any last thoughts?
I mean, I agree. And you know, I know it doesn't seem like it, but in 1999, the Racial Fairness Task Force recommended a sentencing database. And in just 6 months, we've come farther than we have in 25 years. So there is reason to be optimistic.
Excellent. Well, I know I'm extraordinarily optimistic knowing this group of individuals is so hard at work at these sets of issues. Incredibly grateful for all the attendees. We had a huge attendance, which reinforced my sense that there's real reform excitement in the state. And I couldn't be more grateful. Hope everybody will join me in thanking all the panelists and Alex and everybody at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for the work putting this program together. We've obviously just scratched the surface, but all the more reason I like that idea of Gary's. Let's be impatient for our next seminar, and we'll talk about the next set of achievements there. And thanks again to all the panelists. So grateful for your engagement, and let's all keep working hard on these issues and staying in contact. Please visit Drug Enforcement and Policy Center's websites for more information, or let us know how we're doing. And if you'd like more programs like this, we'll do everything we can to keep facilitating them. So with that, I'll call us closed and just say thanks once again, and know we're ever grateful for all the engagement from everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.